I thought moving into this neighborhood meant I could finally breathe. Well-manicured lawns, polite neighbors, and the occasional HOA complaint that was mostly harmless. It felt like a safe little bubble, the kind of place where the biggest worry was whether your grass was the right shade of green. That morning started just like any other. My daughter and I were sitting on the porch, coffee in hand, enjoying the soft warmth of the sun creeping over the rooftops. Birds chirped. The scent of freshly cut grass mixed with morning dew. I thought about how lucky we were to have found a quiet street where nothing exciting ever happened. Then I noticed them, a group of men in uniform standing at the end of our driveway, their hands resting casually but not too casually on what looked like guns. My stomach dropped like a stone. At first I assumed they were police, but something was off. The badges looked cheap, the patches slightly crooked, and their uniforms didn't match any department I recognized. There was an air of fake authority about them, a smug confidence that screamed, "We think we own this street." I froze, my heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. My daughter, though, just looked at them like she had been expecting this moment. I noticed the tiniest smirk at the corner of her mouth, the kind that said, "Go ahead, try me." I wanted to shout at her to get inside, to hide, to run, but there was something magnetic about the way she stood. She didn't flinch, she didn't panic. She simply stepped forward, coffee still in her hand, like this was a casual Tuesday stroll rather than a life-or-death confrontation. The men shouted at us to stay put. Their voices were firm, commanding, almost theatrical, as if they were playing a role in a poorly written movie. I could barely make out the words over the ringing in my ears, my mind racing through all the things I should have done differently. I should have noticed their approach sooner. I should have called someone. I should have anything. But my daughter's calm presence anchored me. She raised her hands slightly, tilted her head, and said something that made me blink. A joke, a sarcastic comment about their uniforms. The words barely registered at first. How could she be joking right now? And yet somehow the tension shifted. I could see it in their eyes, the smallest flicker of doubt. They had assumed fear would be our first reaction. They had assumed compliance. They were wrong. I glanced around. Our neighbors had started peeking from their windows, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disbelief. One neighbor's phone was half raised, probably recording the unfolding chaos. I could feel the air thickening with suspense. The sun was bright, the morning calm, and yet it all felt like the prelude to a storm that was about to hit with full force. Then one of the men moved closer, hand tightening on his weapon. My pulse spiked. My daughter didn't move, she just looked at him, steady, unafraid. My mind screamed at me to act, but my body stayed frozen. It was like watching someone walk a tightrope over a canyon while everyone else holds their breath. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. My daughter wasn't an ordinary teenager. There was something in her stance, the way she measured them, the subtle confidence in her eyes, that told me she was more than capable of handling whatever these men thought they could throw at her. I wanted to speak, to intervene, to protect her, but I knew it was pointless. She had this, I just didn't know how much they would underestimate her before realizing their mistake. The men exchanged quick, uneasy glances, clearly unsure of how to proceed. They were confident, sure, maybe even arrogant, but they hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected someone who radiated calm authority in the face of a weapon. And then it hit me. I had no idea how this morning would end. I had no idea that what started as a quiet, ordinary suburban day was about to spiral into something I would never forget. Something that would change the way I thought about authority, danger, and just how wrong an HOA, or anyone, could go when they decided to play cop in someone else's backyard. But one thing was certain, whatever happened next, it wasn't going to be boring. The men in those fake uniforms stepped closer, their hands still resting on their weapons, eyes scanning the yard like they were hunting something. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to pull my daughter inside, to call someone, anyone who could handle this. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, watching in disbelief as my daughter faced them like it was some sort of game. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't panic. She just tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharp, measuring, almost daring them to take the next step. The tension in the air was so thick I could feel it pressing against my chest. The neighbors were out now, peeking from behind curtains, over fences, even the occasional nose pressed against a window, phones held high. They were witnessing a suburban showdown that had escalated far beyond anyone's expectations. The lead man barked a command. I didn't catch all of it, but I could tell it was a warning, a demand for compliance. My daughter's response was almost casual, a dry remark about how professional they looked for what she assumed was an HOA security squad. It was the kind of line that could have sounded silly in another context, but in that moment it landed perfectly. I watched as their confidence faltered just a fraction, enough to make my stomach twist with hope and fear at the same time. Then one of them moved his gun slightly closer to her. My pulse spiked and I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw myself in front of her, but something told me that would only make matters worse. Instead, I watched, frozen, as she held her ground. There was a precision in her movements, subtle and deliberate, that made it clear she was assessing every angle, every threat, and every possible outcome. I realized, with a mix of pride and terror, that she was thinking 3 steps ahead of these guys, and that thought made me feel both safe and completely powerless. The men whispered among themselves, their voices low and tense. I couldn't hear all the words, but I caught enough to know that doubt was creeping in. They had expected fear, they had expected hesitation. What they got instead was a teenager who moved with authority and calm like she owned the yard. It was almost surreal. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, but my chest felt too tight for laughter. One of the men tried to regain control, taking a more aggressive stance. My daughter didn't flinch. She tilted her chin up slightly and said something under her breath, a quip about reading the HOA handbook before pointing guns at people. It was meant to mock, and it did. I saw it in their eyes. They weren't laughing, but the uncertainty was there. They were off balance, unsure whether to push further or retreat. I could feel every second stretching out, dragging us toward a tipping point. The sun was warm on my shoulders, birds still chirping, and yet the air felt electric, charged with tension. It was like the calmest morning had collided with a nightmare scenario, and somehow my daughter was at the center of it, untouchable, unshakable, and utterly in command. I looked around at the neighbors again, phones raised, faces wide-eyed. Some whispered frantic questions to each other. Others shook their heads, silently judging or perhaps silently praying that this would end without someone getting hurt. I wanted to say something reassuring, but even I wasn't sure how this was going to end. All I could do was watch. And then, almost imperceptibly, one of the men flinched. I noticed it first in his hand, gripping the gun a little tighter, knuckles white. Then his shoulders tensed and a faint flicker of doubt passed through his eyes. My daughter must have noticed it too, because she straightened, shoulders back, exuding an authority that made me feel both awe and fear. In that instant, I realized something important. These men had underestimated her. They assumed this was a simple intimidation exercise. They were wrong. Dead wrong. I wanted to warn them, to tell them who she really was before it escalated further, but I didn't have to. My daughter had already given them the first hint, that she was not someone to mess with. And I could see, in the way their postures shifted, in the tiny twitch of nerves and hesitation, that the tables were about to turn. Whatever happened next, it would change everything. And then she did something that made my heart stop entirely. She reached into her jacket. The men's eyes followed, tense, calculating. I held my breath, barely daring to blink. Whatever came out of that jacket, I knew in that moment it was going to end the guessing game, and it was going to end it in a way no one in that yard would ever forget. My heart was still hammering as I watched her move, calm and deliberate, like she was in complete control of the situation. I couldn't tear my eyes away. Every fiber of my being screamed to act, to intervene, but I knew deep down that trying to protect her now would be a mistake. She was handling this in a way I had never seen before. The men in those fake uniforms were tense, their confident swagger fatting with each passing second. My daughter's eyes scanned them quickly, noting every shift in weight, every subtle twitch in their hands. She didn't speak much, but the small gestures she made, tilting her head slightly, a tiny shrug, a subtle step forward or back, sent messages they weren't prepared to read. I could see it in their eyes, confusion, hesitation, and now an unmistakable hint of fear. One of the men tried to regain authority, stepping closer and barking out another command. My daughter didn't flinch. She just raised a hand in a slow, deliberate motion, signaling him to stop. It was such a simple gesture, but it carried an unspoken weight that made him pause. The man's eyes flicked between her and the others, silently asking, "What the hell is going on?" I realized in that moment that this wasn't just a teenager standing in front of them. This was someone who had been trained, someone who understood strategy, timing, and the subtle art of intimidation. My stomach twisted with a mix of pride and fear. Pride because it was my daughter, and fear because these men had guns. Real or fake, I didn't know, and it didn't matter. One wrong move could change everything. She spoke quietly, almost conversationally, and yet every word landed like a command. She asked them questions, simple questions, but they had the effect of unraveling their confidence. "Do you have a warrant?" she asked. "Whose authority are you claiming right now?" Her voice was calm, almost bored, and it was maddeningly effective. The men looked at each other, uncertain, unsure how to answer without revealing the truth. They were imposters. I could see their arrogance faltering. The confidence that had carried them this far was slipping through their fingers, and it happened so quickly that it made my head spin. My daughter wasn't just holding her ground, she was dismantling them, one careful word, one precise movement at a time, and I, for the first time in my life, felt completely and utterly useless. I was powerless to help her because she didn't need me to. Then came the smallest hint, almost imperceptible, that let me know exactly what was coming. My daughter's hand moved inside her jacket, not hastily, not panicked, but deliberately, with purpose. I didn't dare breathe. The men's eyes followed her movement, their confusion deepening, their posture stiffening. I could feel the tension tighten in the yard like a wire being pulled taut. The neighbors had stopped whispering now. Everyone was frozen in place, waiting, watching, holding their collective breath. I realized at that moment something terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. The men had absolutely no idea what they were about to face. They had assumed that fear and intimidation would be enough to control the situation. They had assumed my daughter was just a typical teenager. They were wrong. So very, very wrong. My daughter's calmness never wavered. I could see her mind working, calculating every possible response, every angle, every risk. The smallest twitch of a hand or a shift in weight from the fake cops would be noted, recorded, and used to her advantage. The tension in the yard was almost unbearable. I wanted to speak, to warn her, to tell her to retreat, but I couldn't. She was untouchable in that moment, and I knew it. Then came the faintest metallic glint from inside her jacket. My stomach lurched. It wasn't just a gesture or a bluff. It was the first step toward a revelation that would change everything in the yard, in the neighborhood, and in the way everyone in those fake uniforms saw her. She was about to reveal something that would strip away every ounce of their confidence and replace it with disbelief, confusion, and fear. I braced myself. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back. This morning, which had begun so quietly and ordinarily, was about to explode into something unforgettable. And for the first time, I realized just how dangerous and powerful my daughter really was, even if no one else in the yard understood it yet. She reached into her jacket slowly, deliberately, almost like she was savoring the moment. My pulse raced as I realized what was about to happen. The men in the fake uniforms were frozen, their eyes following her every movement. Their confidence had already started to crack, but they didn't know how badly their assumptions were about to fail. Then she pulled it out, a federal Marshal badge. My stomach dropped. The shiny metal caught the sunlight, glinting as if announcing to the entire street that everything these men had thought about control and power was about to be upended. I could see the change in them instantly. Their postures stiffened, hands hovering over their weapons as if unsure whether to lower them or bolt. "Federal Marshal," she said quietly, but with authority that made every word hit like a hammer. "You are not authorized to carry weapons here. Step back immediately." The lead man's face went pale. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again as if trying to find words that didn't exist. I could almost see the thought process running through his mind. How did we underestimate this girl? She's a teenager. No, she's something else entirely. What do we do now? Her voice didn't waver. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. But the calm authority she exuded was enough to make the men's bravado crumble. They were pretending to be in control, but it was clear they hadn't prepared for this scenario. I felt a mix of awe and terror, knowing that one wrong move from either side could end badly. One of the fake cops tried to regain some semblance of authority. We're security for the HOA," he stammered. "We're just enforcing neighborhood rules." My daughter tilted her head slightly, as if evaluating the absurdity of his claim. "Neighborhood rules don't give you the authority to point firearms at civilians," she said, voice calm but lethal in its clarity. "Do you understand that?" I could see the tension radiating from them. They were caught between maintaining their bluff and acknowledging the truth. Their plan, if they ever had one beyond intimidation, was unraveling fast. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of the situation, but my chest was too tight with adrenaline. The street had turned into a theater of disbelief, and my daughter was the star, completely in control of the performance. The neighbors were watching now, fully aware that something extraordinary was happening. Phones were raised, capturing every second, and a few whispers floated over the fences. Some of them were laughing nervously, some were wide-eyed, and a few were muttering prayers. I could hear one neighbor whisper, "I can't believe this is happening." The lead fake cop swallowed hard, glancing at his companions. Okay, his voice cracked. His confidence, which had been the backbone of their intimidation, was gone. Every decision he thought he had already made was now in question. My daughter didn't give them a chance to regroup. She moved forward one deliberate step, badge clearly displayed, eyes locked on them. "Drop your weapons now," she said. "Any attempt to escalate this will be considered resisting a federal officer." I could see them hesitate. The guns were still raised, but their fingers shook. They hadn't expected this. No one had. They had walked onto our property thinking they were in control, thinking a little fear and fake authority would be enough. They hadn't counted on competence, presence, and real authority. Then came the moment that confirmed it. One of the men slowly lowered his gun, visibly trembling. Another did the same. The tension in the yard was thick enough to slice with a knife, but the balance of power had shifted completely. My daughter's calm had done what yelling, pleading, or even force could not have done. She had neutralized the threat without firing a single shot. I stepped forward slightly, feeling both pride and relief. I couldn't help it. I had to acknowledge how incredible she was. She turned to me briefly, just a flicker of a smile on her lips before refocusing on the remaining man. Even in that small gesture, I could see the message: this is handled. I don't need you to intervene. For the first time since the men arrived, there was silence. The only sounds were the faint rustle of leaves and the soft hum of morning life trying to continue as if nothing extraordinary were happening, but we all knew nothing would ever be the same again. In that moment, I understood fully that my daughter had not only saved herself but also sent a clear message to everyone in that yard. Authority is earned, not faked, and underestimating someone based on appearances is a dangerous mistake. The fake HOA cops had learned it the hard way, and I had front row seats to their reckoning. The moment her badge was revealed, the air shifted. The men's confidence evaporated like morning mist under the sun. Their hands still hovered near their guns, but now it was hesitation that controlled them, not arrogance. I could feel the tension in the yard tighten, a mix of fear, disbelief, and the slow realization that they had made a grave mistake. My daughter didn't rush, didn't yell, didn't threaten. She simply stood there, calm and deliberate, letting her presence alone shift the balance of power. "Drop your weapons," she said again, this time firmer. Her eyes scanned them with the precision of someone who had been trained for moments exactly like this. There was no anger in her voice, no panic, just authority, and it worked. One by one, the guns lowered, shakily at first, then fully, until there was nothing left but a group of imposters standing in our yard, completely exposed. I wanted to move forward to hug her, to tell her how proud I was, but I stayed frozen. I couldn't take my eyes off the scene unfolding. It was surreal. The fake cops who had arrived so aggressively were now sheepish and uncertain, their faces flushed with fear and embarrassment. They had no plan beyond intimidation, and that plan had crumbled instantly. My daughter didn't waste time with theatrics. She kept her movements calm but precise, stepping just enough to assert authority without appearing aggressive. She asked questions, pointed out inconsistencies in their story, and exposed every bluff they had tried to maintain. One man fumbled with his words, trying to explain the HOA security measures they claimed to enforce, and I could see the panic creeping into his eyes. He had assumed he could control the situation with a uniform and a gun. He was wrong. I watched my neighbors quietly emerge from their homes, some holding phones, others just peering over fences. They were witnessing a suburban showdown that had flipped completely. The disbelief on their faces mirrored my own. It was like watching a scene from a movie where the hero arrives just in time, except in this case, the hero was my daughter and I was watching from the front row. She didn't yell at them, didn't call them names. She was surgical in her words, calm in her presence, and deliberate in her actions. "You are on private property without authority. Any attempt to escalate this situation will be treated as a federal offense," she said. Her voice carried across the yard, steady and unwavering. I could feel the weight of every word, and I could see it in their faces, the recognition that they had completely misjudged who they were dealing with. One of the men tried to act tough, stepping forward slightly, but my daughter didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head, her gaze cutting through him like a laser. "Do not move," she said. "You do not have permission to carry weapons here, and you are not authorized to enforce HOA rules by force." Her calmness was almost terrifying. It was a reminder that real authority doesn't shout, it commands. I felt a surge of pride so strong it nearly knocked the breath from my lungs. This was my daughter. My child, who I had always known was capable, had now demonstrated a level of control, intelligence, and composure that left everyone in the yard stunned. The fake cops were completely dismantled without her raising a finger beyond what was necessary. The lead man finally lowered his eyes, shaking slightly. Another stepped back, hands still raised slightly in surrender. It was over. The situation had been neutralized. My daughter had taken a potentially deadly confrontation and ended it without violence, without panic, and without anyone else needing to intervene. I realized something in that moment. Authority is not something you take by force, it's something you command through competence and presence. My daughter had turned what could have been a nightmare into a lesson, not just for the imposters, but for the entire neighborhood. I could see it in their faces, the mix of fear, respect, and utter disbelief. She turned to me briefly, just a flicker of a smile on her lips before refocusing on the remaining men. I knew in that instant that the fake cops would never forget this day, and neither would anyone who witnessed it. They had walked in thinking they were in control, and in mere moments that illusion had been completely shattered. And in that calm, commanding silence, I realized one undeniable truth. My daughter was unstoppable when she chose to be. I had always known she was capable, but I had never seen her like this, and I had never been prouder. The air in the yard was thick with tension, like the calm before a storm, and yet my daughter's presence made it feel like the storm had already passed, and she was the one controlling the weather. The fake cops were standing there, hands now empty, guns lowered, but I could see in their faces that they were scrambling for a new plan. They hadn't expected the balance of power to shift so dramatically, and now every move they considered was tentative, uncertain, and frankly desperate. One of them fumbled with his phone, muttering something about calling for backup. I recognized the gesture immediately, a last-ditch attempt to regain authority through intimidation. My daughter didn't flinch, her eyes locked on him, unyielding as if daring him to continue. She didn't say a word at first, just waited, letting the silence press against him. The man's hand trembled slightly as he raised the phone to dial, and I could almost feel the panic radiating off him in waves. I wanted to warn him, to tell him that this wasn't going to work, but I didn't have to. My daughter had already read the situation perfectly. She tilted her head slightly, just enough for the sunlight to glint off her badge, and spoke in a calm, deliberate voice. "Do not call anyone, you have no authority here. Any attempt to escalate this will be considered obstruction of federal law enforcement." I could see the confusion ripple through the group. They had assumed that dialing a number would somehow restore their dominance. They hadn't realized that authority isn't just a uniform or a badge, it's knowledge, composure, and presence, and my daughter had all three in spades. One of the fake cops tried to act tough, gesturing with his hands as if to show he still had some control. My daughter raised a single finger, not threatening, just signaling him to stop, and it was enough. He froze mid-motion, uncertainty etched into every line of his body. She didn't need to shout or raise her voice. Every step she took, every movement, conveyed control. It was like watching a chess master predict every move her opponents could make before they even realized it themselves. I could hear neighbors whispering to each other now, some holding phones and recording every second, others just standing in stunned silence. The scene in front of them was surreal. A suburban confrontation had turned into a masterclass in authority and composure, and my daughter was the teacher. The fake cops had no idea how to proceed. They had gone from confident aggressors to panicked imposters in less than 10 minutes. Then one of them made a small, critical mistake. He took a half step forward, trying to regain some semblance of control. My daughter's gaze snapped to him, sharp and unyielding. "Do not move," she said, her voice calm but lethal in its certainty. "Any further attempt to assert authority here will have consequences." The trembling in his hands became more pronounced, and I could see the realization hit him: they were completely outmatched. It was almost comical in its absurdity. These men had arrived with guns, thinking they could intimidate a suburban family. They had assumed fear and compliance would be immediate, but they hadn't accounted for competence, training, and authority that didn't need to shout. My daughter was dismantling every move they made without lifting more than a finger or raising her voice. The lead man finally lowered his eyes, a silent admission that they were defeated. The others followed, their body language shifting from aggression to resignation. I could see the relief on their faces, relief that the situation hadn't escalated further, relief that they hadn't been met with force, and relief that someone in authority had taken control before things went completely wrong. My daughter took a deliberate step forward, her presence commanding, and gave clear instructions for them to leave the property immediately. She didn't threaten, she didn't yell. She simply stated the facts, the law, and the consequences of ignoring them, and they obeyed. One by one, they backed away, retreating down the driveway like sheep, unsure how they had underestimated her so completely. I exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. My chest was tight, my heart still racing, but the fear that had gripped me since that morning had started to fade. The threat had been neutralized, not with violence, but with calm authority, precision, and intelligence. In that moment, I realized something important. People who bluff with authority rarely anticipate what happens when they meet someone who actually possesses it. My daughter had turned what could have been a nightmare into a lesson that the fake cops and everyone watching would never forget, and I had front row seats to witness it all. I thought the ordeal was over once the fake cops retreated, but I was wrong. Just as the last of them disappeared down the driveway, a new wave of tension hit the yard. The HOA president herself showed up, all pink tracksuit and fury, rushing down the street with a clipboard in one hand and a cell phone in the other. Her face was red, her movements frantic, and her eyes darting between the neighbors and my daughter. It was like she had walked straight into a storm she didn't know how to survive. She shouted my name before she even reached the yard. "You can't just ignore the rules," she yelled, waving the clipboard like it was a weapon. "This is about neighborhood safety and—" My daughter didn't flinch. She stood tall, shoulders squared, badge still visible, eyes locked on the woman who had spent months trying to control every little thing about our lives. The calm authority she radiated made the HOA president's shouting seem ridiculous. I had seen my daughter handle intimidation before, but this was something else. "Neighborhood rules don't give you the right to point firearms at anyone," my daughter said calmly, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Especially when those individuals are impersonating law enforcement, you need to step back." I could see the president's face change in an instant. The bluster, the self-righteous indignation, all of it evaporated. She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped mid-sentence like a dog realizing it had bitten off more than it could chew. The neighbors were staring now, some whispering, some shaking their heads, and some quietly recording the exchange. The entire street had turned into an audience for a humiliation the HOA president would never forget. I felt a mix of awe and disbelief. My daughter had neutralized one threat, and now she was turning her attention to the very organization that had been making our lives miserable for months. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had spent so much time enforcing rules, harassing neighbors, and pretending to wield power was now standing in front of someone whose authority could not be questioned, whose competence was absolute. The HOA president tried to regain control, pointing at us, her voice rising. "You can't just, this is my community." My daughter tilted her head slightly, her expression calm but deadly. "You've overstepped repeatedly," she said. "You allowed impersonators to threaten civilians. That is a federal offense. You've also demonstrated repeated misuse of your HOA position. Any further attempt to harass or intimidate my family will result in legal action. Step back now or you will be held accountable." The woman froze. I could see her mind racing, trying to find a way out, a way to justify herself, but my daughter had anticipated every argument, every excuse. It was as if she could see through her thoughts before they even formed. And in that instant, I realized something remarkable. The HOA president was terrified, not of me, not of the neighbors, but of my daughter. Her calm, unshakable presence had shattered the illusion of control the HOA had built over this street. I glanced around. Neighbors were whispering to each other now, some laughing quietly, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Phones were out, recording everything. My daughter's authority was absolute, and the HOA president had no choice but to back down. The tension in the yard was palpable, but the outcome was clear. The HOA had lost. She gave one last look at the president, her voice still calm, still precise. "Leave now, and make sure anyone under your direction does the same. Federal authorities are already aware of this situation. Any further action on your part will be met with consequences." I could see the president's shoulders slump. She looked like a storm cloud that had just hit a brick wall and shattered. Slowly, she backed away, muttering excuses, glancing nervously at the neighbors who had witnessed her complete humiliation. I realized that in a single afternoon, the power dynamic on this street had completely shifted. My daughter turned to me, a faint smirk on her lips, and I could see the unspoken message: "It's done." The street, the HOA, the imposters, they had all learned their lesson. I felt a surge of pride that nearly brought tears to my eyes, not just for her bravery, but for the intelligence, patience, and precision she had shown. The neighbors began murmuring among themselves, some approaching to whisper congratulations, others still wide-eyed from the spectacle. I stood there, watching, realizing that life in this neighborhood would never be the same again, and for the first time, I truly understood just how unstoppable my daughter could be when she chose to be. The yard was finally quiet. The fake cops had vanished, the HOA president had slunk away, and the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, processing everything that had just happened. I sank into the porch chair, feeling my body finally exhale after hours of tension, adrenaline, and disbelief. My daughter, badge still visible, leaned against the railing, calm as ever, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Neighbors began cautiously approaching, their faces a mixture of awe, relief, and barely concealed amusement. Some whispered congratulations, others muttered about how insane the whole situation had been. Phones were still recording, capturing the story that would surely be shared for months, maybe years, across the street and beyond. I could hear snippets of conversation. "Did you see that? She didn't even flinch." And "I can't believe the HOA president was so defeated." It was almost surreal, the way our quiet suburban morning had erupted into something out of a movie script. My daughter finally turned to me, smirking just slightly, that subtle smile that said she knew exactly how impressive she had been and that she didn't need me to tell her. "Well," she said, voice calm and measured, "I think that handles the problem." I laughed, a nervous, shaky sound that had more relief than humor, and shook my head. "Handles the problem? That was more than handling it. You've completely humiliated them, and the whole street witnessed it." She shrugged lightly, like it was no big deal. "They deserved it. They made a mistake thinking fear and fake authority could control anyone here. It's a lesson they won't forget." I glanced around at the yard. The neighbors were still whispering, some now offering smiles and hesitant waves. The tension that had gripped the street for months, thanks to the HOA president's petty overreach, had finally lifted, and I knew in that moment that nothing would ever intimidate my daughter or any of us again. The HOA president had retreated down the street, but I could see from the corner of my eye that she was already on her phone, likely trying to explain herself to someone, anyone who might validate her position. I didn't envy her. She had overstepped, misjudged, and underestimated us, and the consequences were clear. Her bluff had been called, and it had backfired spectacularly. I felt a rush of pride that I could barely put into words. My daughter had not only saved herself, she had dismantled the entire situation without raising a weapon or losing her composure for a second. She had turned what could have been a nightmare into a lesson in authority, calmness, and competence. I realized, with a mixture of relief and awe, that she was more capable than I had ever imagined. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the street and chasing away the remnants of tension, I leaned back and let myself reflect. Life in this neighborhood would never be the same. The fake cops had learned that they couldn't intimidate anyone, and the HOA president had learned that her petty rules had no weight against authority that truly mattered. And my daughter and I, had learned something too. Confidence, preparation, and calm can turn even the most dangerous situations in your favor. Neighbors slowly returned to their homes, whispers fading to normal suburban chatter. The yard was peaceful again, almost as if nothing had happened except for the lingering awe that everyone felt, especially me. I glanced at my daughter once more. She was smiling faintly now, casual, composed, like she had just walked through the most ordinary morning of her life, but I knew better. I had witnessed something extraordinary. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about how differently it could have gone, how fragile control is when authority is faked, and how absolute it can be when it's real. My daughter had turned fear into respect, chaos into order, and threat into a lesson that would be remembered in this neighborhood for years to come. As we finally sat down to have the coffee we had abandoned hours earlier, I realized something important. It wasn't just the fake cops or the HOA that had learned a lesson today. I had learned one too. I had learned that sometimes the people you think need protecting are already capable of protecting themselves, and in ways you never imagined. I looked at her, my pride overwhelming, and said quietly, "I guess we're never underestimated again." She smirked just slightly, that same subtle confidence. "Not a chance," she said, and I knew without a doubt that she meant it. The morning had started as any other, peaceful and ordinary, but it ended as something unforgettable. A day that began with fear and uncertainty had transformed into a story of authority, calm, and justice. And in that transformation, I realized one undeniable truth. My daughter was unstoppable when she chose to be, and nothing, not fake cops, not petty HOA rules, not anyone would ever change that. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.